Before there were pharaohs to rule the land of Egypt, before there were pyramids to pierce the sky, there was only darkness. A vast, silent ocean of nothing stretching endlessly in every direction. The Egyptians called this primeval water Nu, and within it slept the potential for all existence. And then, from this formless deep, came light, came warmth, came a god who would become the very heartbeat of Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. This was Ra. To understand Ra is to understand how the ancient Egyptians understood existence itself, because Ra was not merely a god among gods. He was the sun, given divine form and consciousness, the literal source of life, warmth, and order in a universe that could so easily collapse into chaos. Each morning, as golden light spilled across the desert sands and crept along the banks of the Nile, the Egyptians believed they were witnessing nothing less than the daily rebirth of their greatest deity. Picture him now, as the ancient artisans did, carving his likeness into temple walls and tomb ceilings. Ra is most often shown as a man with the head of a falcon, his eyes sharp and ancient, crowned with a blazing solar disk encircled by a rearing cobra. The protective Uraeus, ready to spit fire at any who threatened him. Sometimes he takes the form of the falcon itself, wings outstretched across the heavens. Other times, particularly in his more primordial aspect, he appears as a scarab beetle, pushing the sun across the sky just as the humble dung beetle rolls its ball of earth. A symbol the Egyptians found endlessly poetic, since from that rolled sphere, new life would eventually emerge. But Ra's true domain extended far beyond mere appearance. He was Lord of the sky, the earth, and the underworld alike, a trinity of dominion held by no other deity in the Egyptian pantheon. The Egyptians believed that Ra had once ruled directly over Egypt as its first pharaoh, walking among mortals in a golden age before age, and treachery drove him back into the heavens. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Every king who sat upon Egypt's throne thereafter claimed to be his living descendant, carrying the title Son of Ra as the highest honor a mortal ruler could bear. To question the pharaoh was, in some sense, to question Ra himself. And yet Ra's existence was far from peaceful. Each night, as his light vanished beneath the western horizon, the Egyptians believed he did not simply rest. Instead, he boarded a magnificent solar bark, a ship of pure light, and began a perilous journey through the Du'a, the treacherous underworld realm that lay beneath the earth, where the sun's warmth could not reach, and ancient horrors waited in the dark. Chief among these horrors was Apep, a colossal serpent of chaos, coiled and hungry, who tried each and every night to devour Ra and plunge the universe into eternal darkness. And each night, Ra fought him, with the aid of loyal gods like Set, who speared the serpent back into the shadows. Ra triumphed again and again, ensuring that dawn would come once more. This was not a battle won once, but a battle fought eternally, a nightly act of cosmic courage that the Egyptians quietly trusted in. The way we trust that morning will follow midnight. It is a strangely moving thought, isn't it? That for the ancient people along the Nile, sunrise was never something assumed. It was something earned, fought for, won. Ra's legends are filled with moments that reveal both his immense power and his deeply human vulnerabilities. There is the tale of how the clever goddess Isis, longing for greater power, created a venomous serpent to bite the aging Ra, then refused to heal him until he revealed his most secret, true name, the name from which all his power flowed. There is the haunting story of the Eye of Ra, sent out as a fierce, independent force to punish humanity for their disobedience, nearly destroying mankind entirely before being calmed with rivers of beer disguised as blood. These are not simple tales. They speak to power, pride, mercy, and the delicate balance the Egyptians believed governed their entire world. As we move forward together into this journey, we will explore the many forms Ra took as he merged with other great gods, the magnificent temples raised in his honor, the priesthoods that grew wealthy and powerful in his service, and the long, slow twilight of his worship, as Egypt itself changed across the centuries. For now, simply picture the sun rising once more over ancient sands, patient, golden, eternal. Let us begin. To truly understand Ra, we must travel back further still, past even his reign as a living king, past the legends of serpents and secret names, to the very beginning of time itself. For before there was a sun god to worship, there was only the question that haunted every ancient civilization that ever gazed up at the stars. How did something come from nothing? The Egyptians, ever poetic in their theology, answered this question with water, not the gentle, life-giving water of the Nile that they knew so intimately, but something far older and stranger. Nu, the boundless primeval ocean that existed before existence, a realm without light, without time, without form. Within this infinite darkness floated the potential for all things dormant and waiting, like a seed beneath frozen soil through an endless winter. And then, something stirred. The most enduring version of this story comes to us from the ancient city of Heliopolis, known to the Egyptians themselves as Ianu, the place of pillars. This was no ordinary city. It was perhaps the most important theological center in all of Egypt, a place where priests devoted their entire lives to the study and worship of the sun, and where the great creation myth of Ra took its most complete and beautiful form. Sadly, almost nothing remains of Heliopolis today. It lies buried beneath the sprawl of modern Cairo, its temples dismantled long ago, their stones quarried away for other monuments. But in its time, it was a city of staggering importance, a place where the very nature of existence was contemplated and codified. According to the priests of Heliopolis, Ra did not simply appear within the waters of Nu. He emerged. Some versions of the myth tell us he rose up from the dark ocean atop a primordial mound of earth, the very first solid ground to exist anywhere in the cosmos, a small hill of dry land breaking through the surface of infinite water, not unlike the way the fertile black soil of Egypt itself would emerge each year as the Nile's flood waters receded. This was no accident of storytelling. The Egyptians lived their theology through their landscape, the yearly miracle of the Nile's retreat, revealing rich farmland from beneath the floodwaters, was for them a living echo of that first, original act of creation. Other versions of the tale describe Ra emerging instead from a lotus flower, its petals slowly unfurling upon the waters of Nu to reveal the radiant god within. An image of such striking, gentle beauty that it became one of the most beloved symbols in all of Egyptian art. Still others speak of Ra hatching from a cosmic egg, laid upon that same primordial mound by a celestial bird, or self-creating in the form of the scarab beetle Khepri, whose name itself meant to come into being. It is worth pausing here, in this quiet moment, to appreciate something remarkable. The Egyptians did not insist on a single, rigid version of this story. They held multiple creation accounts simultaneously, layering them atop one another like sediment along the riverbanks, each one illuminating a different facet of the same impossible truth. Ra was not born through processes ancient Egyptians fully claimed to understand. He simply was. Eternal, self-created, the first cause from which all subsequent causes would flow. Once Ra came into being, his very first act, and arguably his most consequential, was to speak. The Egyptians believed deeply in the creative power of the spoken word, the idea that to name a thing was, in some profound sense, to bring it into reality. And so Ra began to call out the names of the world around him. And as each name left his lips, that piece of creation solidified into being. Light separated from darkness. The sky lifted away from the earth. Order, what the Egyptians called Ma'at, began to take shape from the swirling potential of chaos. But Ra did not create the universe, and then withdraw to watch from a distance. He continued his work of creation by bringing forth other gods, beginning what would become known as the Ennead, a sacred grouping of 9 deities worshipped at Heliopolis, each one born from Ra in succession, each one representing another fundamental force shaping the cosmos. In one striking version of this myth, Ra, lacking a partner with whom to create life, simply created life from himself. Some accounts say he spat the next gods into existence. Others, more intimate still, describe him achieving this act of creation alone, through what we might gently call self-conception, a reflection of just how singular and self-sufficient the Egyptians believed their solar god to be. From Ra came Shu, god of air, and his twin sister Tefnut, goddess of moisture. The first pair of siblings, the first division of the world into elements that could embrace and separate, mingle and part, much as wind moves through humid air along the riverbanks even now. From Shu and Tefnut came Geb, the earth god, and Nut, goddess of the sky, whose own dramatic love story would later need Shu's intervention to physically separate them, lifting Nut's star-strewn body high above her husband's earthly form, creating the very space in which life as the Egyptians knew it could exist. And from Geb and Nut, in turn, came 4 more deities whose names would echo through Egyptian mythology for millennia after Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, the great players in the dramas yet to come. Death and resurrection, betrayal and devotion, kingship and chaos, all of them ultimately descendants of Ra, the light from which their stories would eventually take their warmth. It's a beautiful structure when you step back and consider it as a whole, isn't it? A family tree of the universe itself, with Ra not merely as a distant creator, God observing his work from some untouchable throne, but as a literal ancestor, a grandfather and great-grandfather, to the very forces governing wind, water, earth and sky. This is perhaps part of why Ra's worship endured so powerfully for so long. He was not an abstract, unknowable force. He was woven directly into the family of gods that ancient Egyptians prayed to every single day. The patriarch whose blood, so to speak, ran through every subsequent deity and, by extension, through the pharaoh who ruled in his name. The priests of Heliopolis elevated this theology to extraordinary heights, developing complex rituals and astronomical observations that allowed them to track Ra's movements with remarkable precision. They built great obelisks, slender, towering monuments capped with shining metal, often electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, designed specifically to catch the very first and very last rays of sunlight each day, a physical embodiment of Ra's eternal presence reaching down to touch the earth he had created. Imagine standing in the shadow of one of these obelisks in ancient Heliopolis, watching dawn light strike its golden tip first, before spreading slowly down across the temple complex below. A daily reminder that the God who had once called the universe itself into being still walked, still watched, still ruled, every single morning. This creation story did far more than simply explain the past. It established something essential about the present, a cosmic order, a structure to existence itself that the Egyptians called Ma'at, balanced eternally and precariously against the forces of chaos that Ra himself had first pushed back when he rose from the dark waters of Nu. Every sunrise, then, was not just beautiful. It was a quiet reaffirmation that the order Ra established at the dawn of time still held, still mattered, still protected the world from slipping back into that primeval, formless dark. And so, with the cosmos now shaped, the gods now born and order now established, we find ourselves ready to ask a deeper question still, one that lies at the very center of Ra's daily existence. What, exactly, did this eternal journey across the sky actually look like? What dangers, what rituals, what extraordinary cosmic theater unfolded every single day as Ra carried his light from one horizon to the other? That story, the story of Ra's eternal voyage, awaits us next. There is a rhythm to the Egyptian cosmos, steady and unbroken, older than memory itself. It is the rhythm of a god in constant motion, never resting, never truly still, bound to an endless cycle that the Egyptians believed had been repeating since the very first morning of creation. To watch the sun cross the sky, for the people of the Nile, was never simply to observe a natural phenomenon. It was to witness a living God in the act of traveling, struggling, and triumphing hour by hour, every single day of existence. Let us follow him now, from the very first light of dawn, in the cool stillness before sunrise, when the eastern horizon begins to blush with the faintest hint of gold. The Egyptians believed Ra emerged in his youngest and most vulnerable form. Khepri, the scarab-headed god, newly born and fragile, much like the rising sun itself, still low and soft enough to gaze upon directly. There is something profoundly tender in this image, isn't there? A god of immense, world-shaping power, choosing to greet each new day, not as a conquering force, but as something newly born, fresh and untested, requiring the careful nurturing of the gods and priests alike to grow into his full strength. As the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher into the sky, Khepri gave way to Ra himself in his prime, falcon-headed, crowned with a blazing solar disk, radiating the full, undeniable power of midday heat. This was Ra at his most magnificent, the sun standing high and commanding at its zenith, light pouring down across the temples, the farmlands, the bustling markets along the Nile, touching every corner of Egyptian life with equal, impartial warmth. It was in this form that Ra was most often worshipped in the great temples, his power at its absolute height, his presence undeniable to anyone who simply looked up. And then, as afternoon stretched toward evening, as the light softened and lengthened into long golden shadows across the desert sand, Ra transformed once more. This time into Atum, an elderly, weary god, sometimes depicted as a ram-headed figure, his strength spent from the long day's labor, preparing now for the most dangerous part of his journey. Three forms, then, for three stages of life itself: birth, vigorous maturity, and the wisdom and fragility of old age. The Egyptians had taken the simple, observable arc of the sun's daily path and transformed it into something achingly human, a reflection of every mortal life that would ever be lived beneath that same sky. But how did Ra actually travel? Not by walking, the Egyptians believed, nor by flying alone through open air. Ra moved across the heavens aboard a magnificent vessel, the solar bark, sometimes called the manned jet, the boat of millions of years. Picture it now, a sleek, gleaming ship crafted of pure light, large enough to carry not only Ra himself, but an entire retinue of protective gods who accompanied him on his daily voyage. This was no solitary journey. Ra traveled in the company of loyal deities, among them Set, the fierce and often misunderstood god of chaos and storms, whose raw strength made him an invaluable protector despite his troublesome reputation in other myths, and Wadjet, the cobra goddess, ever watchful, ever ready to strike at danger before it could strike first. As the bark carried Ra across the daytime sky, the Egyptians believed it sailed upon a great celestial river, a heavenly mirror of the Nile itself, stretching from horizon to horizon. This was no coincidence of imagination. The Nile was the lifeblood of Egyptian civilization, the single thread upon which all existence depended, and so it only made sense to the ancient mind that the sun, too, would require a river of its own to navigate the vast expanse of sky. Yet as beautiful as the daytime journey was, It was the night that truly defined Ra's legend. The part of his story that revealed his courage, his vulnerability, and the eternal stakes upon which the Egyptians believed the entire fate of the world rested. As the sun finally dipped below the western horizon and darkness spread its quiet hand across the land, the Egyptians did not believe that Ra simply vanished or rested peacefully until morning. Instead, they believed something far more dramatic unfolded. Ra descended into the Du'a, the shadowed underworld realm that lay beneath the earth, a place of trial, judgment, and ancient terror, through which he would need to sail his bark across 12 perilous hours of darkness before he could be reborn once again at dawn. The Duat was no simple void. It was a richly imagined landscape, mapped out in extraordinary detail across the walls of royal tombs and in sacred funerary texts such as the Amdua, literally, that which is in the underworld, and the Book of Gates. These texts describe each of the 12 hours of the night in vivid, almost cinematic detail. Each hour its own distinct region, guarded by its own set of fearsome gatekeepers, populated by serpents both benevolent and monstrous, by the souls of the dead awaiting judgment, by rivers of fire and fields of reeds, by gods so ancient and strange that even their names carried protective power when spoken aloud. Within this realm, Ra transformed once more, taking on the form of a ram-headed deity, his power now turned inward, focused not on radiating light outward across the living world, but on the far more dangerous task of navigating darkness itself, illuminating the underworld just enough to allow the souls of the dead, who dwelled there in eternal stillness, a brief glimpse of light and renewal as his bark passed by. Even the dead, in other words, depended on Ra's nightly courage. His journey was not simply about his own survival until morning. It was an act of mercy extended to every soul who had ever lived and died. A brief, golden visitation in the heart of endless night. But this journey was never safe. Lurking within the depths of the Duat was Apep, known to the Greeks later as Apophis, a creature of pure primordial chaos, taking the form of a colossal serpent, vast beyond imagining, coiled in ambush along the dark waters of the underworld river. Apep represented everything Ra's act of creation had pushed back at the dawn of time, the formless, hungry chaos that existed before order, before light, before Ma'at had been established. Each night, without fail, Apep attacked, attempting to swallow Ra's bark whole, to devour the sun itself, and plunge the entire universe back into the same primeval darkness from which Ra had first emerged. And each night, the battle was won, but never easily. The texts describe a chaotic, violent struggle, Set standing at the prow of the bark, spear in hand, driving the great serpent back into the depths, other gods chanting protective spells, their voices themselves acting as weapons against Apep's chaos. The goddess Isis, in some versions, lending her formidable magic to the fight. It is worth noting that the Egyptians did not consider this battle some distant, completed myth, finished long ago and safely behind them. They believed it was happening that very night. Every night, an active and ongoing cosmic struggle that required real-world participation to ensure victory. Priests at temples across Egypt would perform nightly rituals, reciting spells from texts such as the Book of Overthrowing Apep, even ritually destroying wax effigies of the serpent, believing their earthly actions directly assisted Ra in his unseen battle far below. To neglect these rituals, the Egyptians feared, was to risk the unthinkable, a morning when the sun simply did not rise. There is something quietly profound in this belief when you sit with it for a moment. The Egyptians did not take sunrise for granted, not even slightly. Every single dawn was understood as a hard-won victory, a nightly reaffirmation that order had once again triumphed over chaos, that light had once again triumphed over darkness, that the careful structure of existence Ra had first called into being at the dawn of time still held firm against the forces that would unmake it. Imagine living with that awareness every single day of your life, greeting each sunrise not with simple comfort, but with genuine relief and gratitude, knowing that somewhere, unseen, a battle had been fought and won on your behalf through the long hours of night. By the time Ra's bark reached the final hour of the duat, weary Atum had endured the worst of the journey's dangers, and as the eastern horizon began to lighten once more, Ra prepared for his final transformation, shedding his nighttime form, gathering strength for rebirth, ready to emerge once again as young Khepri, pushing the renewed sun up over the horizon exactly as he had the morning before, and the morning before that, stretching back across the unbroken chain of days to the very beginning of time itself. And so the cycle continued. Birth, strength, age, death, and rebirth, repeating eternally, the very heartbeat of Egyptian cosmology made visible in the sky above every single day. It is little wonder, then, that the pharaohs themselves looked to this cycle as the model for their own destiny after death, believing that just as Ra was reborn each morning, so too might a righteous king find his own rebirth in the world beyond. And that connection between the eternal cycle of the sun and the eternal hopes of Egypt's kings is precisely where our journey turns to next. There has never been, in the long and complicated history of human civilization, quite so complete and absolute a fusion of religion and political power as the one the ancient Egyptians constructed between their sun god and their kings. Other cultures deified their rulers. Other civilizations built temples and demanded prayers on behalf of those who sat upon thrones. But Egypt went further, deeper, and with a theological precision that still astonishes historians today. The pharaoh was not simply favored by Ra, nor merely protected by him, nor even simply chosen by him. The pharaoh, in a very real and literal sense, the ancient Egyptians fully believed, was Ra, made flesh, descended from heaven, walking among his people in human form. To understand how this extraordinary claim came to shape one of history's greatest civilizations, we must first understand what the pharaoh actually represented in the Egyptian worldview, because it extended far beyond simple political authority. The pharaoh was the single living point of contact between the human world and the divine order, the one being who could negotiate with the gods on behalf of all of Egypt, whose performance of sacred rituals was not merely ceremonial, but cosmologically necessary. Without the pharaoh performing his duties correctly, the Egyptians believed, Ma'at itself, that delicate balance of order, truth, and harmony that Ra had established at the dawn of creation could begin to unravel. The crops might fail, the Nile might refuse to flood, Hapep might, one terrible morning, finally win. This was an enormous weight for one person to carry, and the theological scaffolding constructed around the pharaoh's divinity served in part to make that weight bearable, both for the ruler himself and for the people who depended upon him, by declaring the king to be Ra's own son, indeed Ra's earthly embodiment. The Egyptians were not simply flattering their monarch, they were constructing a system of cosmic reassurance. As long as the living Ra walked among them, as long as the rituals were performed and the offerings made, the universe itself was in safe hands. The title most directly connecting Pharaoh to the sun god was simple and direct. Sao Ra, meaning son of Ra. From as early as the 4th dynasty, around 2600 BCE, this became a standard element of the royal titulary, the formal set of names and titles every pharaoh bore from the moment of his coronation. But it was more than a title. It was a genealogical claim, a statement of literal divine descent that stretched back, in the Egyptian imagination, to that golden age when Ra himself had walked the earth as Egypt's first king, a mythological era before human memory, when gods and mortals still shared the same world openly. The story of Ra's earthly kingship, preserved in texts such as the Memphite theology and various royal inscriptions, describes an early world in which Ra ruled directly as pharaoh, presiding over a perfect, harmonious Egypt. And yet even the gods, it seemed, were not immune to the ravages of time. As Ra aged, as his bones became silver, his flesh gold, his hair the deepest lapis lazuli, his grip upon the world began to loosen, and humanity, sensing this weakness, grew bold enough to plot against him. This moment in the mythology is quietly devastating. The mightiest being in creation, grown old and vulnerable, facing betrayal from the very creatures his light had warmed and sustained. In response, as we touched upon in our opening journey, Ra sent forth his eye, a terrifying force of divine wrath that nearly annihilated humanity entirely before Ra himself, moved by something between mercy and weariness, chose to pull back from destruction. It is after this incident that Ra withdraws from direct earthly rulership, ascending permanently into the heavens aboard the celestial cow goddess Nut, leaving the earth to be governed first by other gods in succession, Shu, Geb, Osiris, and ultimately by the human pharaohs who would claim descent from this divine royal lineage. The withdrawal was not defeat, the Egyptians were careful to emphasize. It was transformation. Ra had simply moved from ruling the earth directly to ruling it from above. His presence now felt not as a walking, breathing king, but as the light that fell equally upon every corner of his kingdom, every single morning without exception. Each new pharaoh, then, stepped into this legacy at the moment of coronation, ritually becoming both Horus, the living falcon god, and son of Osiris, and the son of Ra simultaneously, embodying both the earthly succession of divine kingship and the solar bloodline that stretched back to creation itself. These two identities were not seen as contradictory or competing. They were complementary layers of the same divine authority. Like light seen through different facets of a crystal, each angle revealing something the others could not. Nowhere is this royal solar theology more magnificently expressed than in the great temples and monuments built to honor Ra across the entirety of Egyptian history. The pyramid itself, that most iconic of all Egyptian structures, was almost certainly conceived as a solar symbol, its sloping faces representing the rays of the sun descending to earth, a permanent stone bridge between the heavenly realm of Ra and the earthly realm of his royal son. When sunlight struck the smooth, original white limestone casing of the great pyramids at Giza, they would have blazed with reflected brilliance visible for miles across the desert, not simply tombs for dead kings, but beacons of solar energy anchoring the divine order to the earth itself. The pyramid texts, among the oldest religious writings yet discovered anywhere in the world, are explicit about this solar destiny awaiting the righteous pharaoh after death. These extraordinary inscriptions, carved into the inner chambers of Old Kingdom pyramids beginning around 2400 BCE, describe in vivid detail the dead king's journey to join Ra in the heavens, boarding the solar barque, taking his place among the crew of divine protectors, sailing eternally alongside the father from whom he had always claimed descent. Death, for the pharaoh, was not separation from Ra, but reunion with him. This solar identity reached perhaps its most dramatic, controversial, and historically fascinating expression during the reign of Amenhotep IV, the pharaoh who would remake himself entirely in Ra's image, abandoning his birth name, abandoning the entire traditional Egyptian pantheon, and declaring a single solar deity, the Aten, the physical disk of the sun itself, to be the one true god of Egypt. Renaming himself Akhenaten, meaning effective spirit of the Aten, he built an entirely new capital city in the desert, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, aligned with extraordinary precision to the movements of the sun. He closed the temples of other gods, redirected their vast wealth, erased divine names from monuments across Egypt, and declared himself and his queen Nefertiti to be the sole intermediaries between humanity and the solar disk. Not sons and daughters of Ra in the traditional sense, but something even more radical, a living reflection of the sun itself with no other gods permitted to stand alongside them. Akhenaten's solar revolution lasted barely 17 years before it was dismantled with remarkable thoroughness by those who came after him. His city abandoned, his monuments defaced, his very name erased from the official king lists as though he had never existed. Yet even this violent rejection of his ideas speaks, in its own strange way, to just how deep and destabilizing the connection between Ra and royal power truly ran. Akhenaten had not invented the association between pharaoh and sun. He had simply pushed it to its absolute, uncompromising extreme, stripping away every intermediary and every competing divine narrative until only the bare, blazing solar disk remained. Egypt's traditional priests and nobility could not survive such a stripping away. The old system, with all its layered complexity and its network of temple economies and priestly authorities, reasserted itself with force the moment the radical Sun King died. But here is the quiet irony that history offers us. Even as they erased Akhenaten's name, even as they restored Amun and Osiris and the full company of Egypt's gods to their rightful temples, the priests and kings who dismantled his revolution never once questioned the fundamental premise that lay beneath it. The pharaoh was still Ra's son. The sun still rose each morning as proof of divine order. The solar bark still sailed. The battle against Apep was still fought and won each night. What Akhenaten had attempted, ultimately, was not the creation of something entirely new. It was the radical simplification of something ancient and enduring. The same soul of faith that had been quietly shaping Egypt's politics, architecture, art, and spiritual life since the very earliest dynasties. Strip away the drama of his heresy, and what remains is recognizable. A king, standing beneath the same sun as every pharaoh before and after him, claiming its light as his inheritance. That light fell on temples and tombs, on obelisks and offering tables, on the faces of priests who spent their entire lives in Ra's service. And it is to those remarkable temples, and to the extraordinary rituals performed within them, that our journey now leads us. Consider for a moment what it would mean to believe that the God you worshipped was not simply present in some abstract spiritual sense, watching from a distance, accessible only through prayer and quiet contemplation, but was physically, materially present within the walls of your temple, dwelling there in the form of a sacred statue, as real and alive and requiring of care as any living king. This was the conviction at the heart of ancient Egyptian temple religion. The great temples of Egypt were not gathering places for congregations of ordinary worshippers seeking personal communion with their god. They were, in the most literal understanding of the people who built and maintained them, the homes of the gods themselves. Vast, elaborately constructed divine residences staffed by small armies of priests whose central daily task was to tend to their resident deities' every need. And no deity in Egypt required more elaborate, more precisely maintained, more cosmologically charged care than Ra. The most ancient and sacred site of Ra's worship was Heliopolis, that great theological city we have already visited briefly in our story of creation. Though its physical remains have been swallowed almost entirely by the centuries and by the sprawl of modern Cairo, we know from ancient texts, from Greek travel accounts, and from the surviving obelisks that were carried away to adorn foreign cities, that Heliopolis at its height was a place of staggering scale and magnificence. Its great temple complex, known as the Per-Ra, the House of Ra, stretched across an area so vast that later Greek visitors compared it favorably to the grandest sanctuaries of their own civilization. At its heart stood the most sacred object in all of Ra's worship, the Ben-Ben stone. The Ben-Ben was a sacred stone of roughly conical or pyramidal shape, believed to be the primordial mound upon which Ra had first stood at the dawn of creation, the very first solid ground in all of existence, given permanent physical form. To stand before the Benben was, in the Egyptian theological imagination, to stand at the literal origin point of the universe itself, the spot from which all subsequent creation had radiated outward like ripples across the surface of still water. Its shape almost certainly inspired both the obelisk and the pyramid, two of the most recognizable and enduring forms in all of Egyptian architectural history, both of them quiet echoes of that original sacred stone, reaching skyward toward the sun, their forms commemorated. The priests who served at Heliopolis and at the other great solar temples of Egypt occupied a world of extraordinary ritual precision, one that began long before the sun itself appeared on the horizon each morning. They rose before dawn, underwent careful ritual purification, bathing in sacred waters, chewing natron to cleanse the mouth, shaving the body entirely, since impurity in any form was considered dangerous in the presence of divine energy, and then processed in ordered silence through the darkened temple complex toward the sanctuary, where Ra's cult statue resided through the night. This statue was not merely a representation of the god. It was understood to be animated by Ra's divine essence, his Ba, a concept we might loosely translate as his soul or vital spirit, which took up residence within the carved and gilded form each night, and required careful, attentive service to maintain its divine health and presence. The morning ritual opened the sealed sanctuary doors with formal prayers and gestures of reverence. As though waking a sleeping king, the statue would then be undressed from its previous day's ceremonial garments, carefully cleansed, anointed with precious oils, myrrh, frankincense, cedar, redressed in fresh linen of the purest white, and presented with offerings of food, drink, incense, and flowers in a careful sequence that mirrored, quite deliberately, the service one would provide to a living royal household. This was not metaphor. The Egyptians genuinely understood themselves to be feeding Ra, clothing him, perfuming his presence, maintaining his divine body in exactly the condition required for him to continue performing his cosmic functions. A poorly maintained god was a distracted god, and a distracted Ra was an existential danger to everything the sun sustained. This daily ritual was repeated multiple times throughout the course of the day, timed with specific solar moments: sunrise, midday, sunset. Each ritual marking one of the three great transformations of Ra's daily journey that we have already traced across the sky. Incense was burned in quantities that ancient accounts describe as extraordinary, even by the lavish standards of the ancient world. Its fragrant smoke understood to rise heavenward as a direct form of communication, carrying offerings and prayers physically upward on the thermal columns of warm air toward the divine realm above the clouds. Beyond the daily maintenance rituals, the temples of Ra were also the setting for great festival celebrations throughout the Egyptian calendar year, moments when the carefully maintained privacy of the temple sanctuary was partially opened outward, and Ra's presence was, in a sense, carried beyond his house and into the streets and waterways of the surrounding community. These festival processions, in which the god statue was transported in a specially crafted portable sacred bark, a miniature echo of the cosmic solar bark that carried Ra across the heavens, allowed ordinary Egyptians their closest point of contact with the divine. Lining the processional routes, bringing their personal petitions written on ostraca, small pottery shards used as makeshift notepaper, the common people of Egypt could ask questions of the oracle, seek the god's blessing, and feel themselves briefly, gloriously close to the warmth that governed the cosmos. It is important to pause here and acknowledge something that can be easy to overlook when we speak of priests and rituals and grand theological systems. The vast majority of ordinary Egyptians did not experience Ra primarily through the great temples of Heliopolis or through elaborate priestly ritual. They experienced him in the morning, stepping outside into the warmth of the rising sun. They experienced him in the reliable growing of their crops, in the safety of the Nile's annual flood, in the simple daily fact that the world continued, orderly, warm, sustained. Personal religious practice in ancient Egypt was rich and varied, filled with small household shrines, amulets bearing Ra's solar imagery, spells drawn from funerary texts adapted for the use of the living, prayers spoken quietly in the pre-dawn dark by farmers and fishermen, and craftsmen who may never once in their lives have set foot inside a temple precinct. The most widespread, protective symbol associated with Ra's power in everyday Egyptian life was the Eye of Ra. That fierce, independent aspect of the god's divine force that we briefly encountered in our opening chapter, represented most commonly as the Wedjat, the so-called Eye of Horus, which was in practice deeply entangled with the Eye of Ra in Egyptian theological understanding. This symbol appeared on amulets worn by the living and the dead alike, painted on the prows of fishing boats to watch for danger, incorporated into jewelry, architecture, and funerary equipment across every social level. To carry the Eye of Ra was to carry a fragment of the sun's protective fire, a portion of that formidable divine gaze that could strike down enemies with the same scorching intensity as the midday sun itself. The priests who rose through the ranks of Ra's temple service occupied some of the most powerful institutional positions in all of Egyptian society. The high priest of Heliopolis, holding the remarkable title Greatest of Seers, was among the most influential religious figures in the entire kingdom, second perhaps only to the high priest of Amun at Karnak during the New Kingdom's height. The temple estates associated with Ra's worship accumulated staggering wealth across the centuries. Land grants from grateful pharaohs, donations of cattle and gold and grain, the revenues of entire agricultural regions flowing into priestly coffers in the god's name. This wealth gave the priestly class an independence and influence that could, at certain volatile moments in Egyptian history, rival and even challenge the authority of the pharaoh himself, a tension that would simmer quietly beneath the surface of Egyptian politics for centuries, occasionally boiling over in ways that reshaped the entire theological landscape. And yet, for all the political complexity and institutional weight that accumulated around Ra's worship, there is something underneath it all, something quieter and more enduring than any temple economy or priestly hierarchy, that speaks to why this particular god held such an unbroken grip upon Egyptian imagination for so many thousands of years. Ra's temples were grand and his rituals elaborate, yes, but the truest temple of Ra was always the open sky itself. The most honest act of Ra worship was performed each morning by every living person who opened their eyes to a world still warm and bright, still ordered and sustained, still held together by the light that had first been called into being at the dawn of all things. Every stone obelisk, every carved relief, every carefully folded linen offering, every grain of incense that ever curled upward in the warm desert air of an Egyptian temple, all of it was, in the end, simply humanity's attempt to respond appropriately to something that needed no temple at all to make itself known. The sun had been rising, after all, long before there were priests to greet it. And yet, as Egypt's extraordinary civilization began to change, as new gods rose to prominence, as foreign powers cast long shadows across the Nile Valley, and as the old certainties of the solar faith encountered the deep, rich complexity of Egypt's evolving religious imagination, Ra himself would change too, merging, transforming, and reinventing himself in ways that speak not to weakness, but to a remarkable theological resilience. That final transformation, and what became of Ra's worship in the long twilight of ancient Egypt, is where our journey now, at last, arrives. Nothing in the ancient world lasted forever unchanged. Not kingdoms, not dynasties, not even the gods themselves. And yet the measure of a truly great deity is not whether they remain static across the centuries, frozen in the form their first worshippers gave them, but whether they possessed the theological elasticity to grow, to absorb, to merge with new ideas without losing the essential fire at their core. By this measure, Ra was not merely great, he was extraordinary, a god who reinvented himself repeatedly across 3,000 years of Egyptian history, merging with other powerful deities, not as an act of diminishment, but as an act of expansion, each union adding new dimensions to his already vast divine identity without ever extinguishing the solar light at his center. The most significant and enduring of these divine mergers was the one that gave rise to Amun-Ra, the composite deity who would eventually become the dominant god of the entire Egyptian pantheon during the extraordinary period of the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to N70 BCE, the age of Egypt's greatest imperial expansion and its most breathtaking architectural achievements. Amun himself had originally been a relatively local deity, worshipped primarily at Thebes in Upper Egypt, a god of hidden, invisible power, his very name meaning the Hidden One, representing the unseen wind and the mystery of divine forces that operated beneath the surface of the visible world. On the surface, Amun and Ra might seem like theological opposites, one a god of visible, blazing light, the other a god of hidden, invisible essence. And yet the Egyptians saw in this apparent contradiction not opposition but perfect complementarity. To merge the hidden with the revealed, the invisible source of power with its radiant outward expression, was to arrive at something more complete and more truthful than either deity alone could represent. Amun-Ra became, under the New Kingdom pharaohs who championed his worship with unparalleled devotion and generosity, the king of all gods, a title held with an authority that extended far beyond Egypt's own borders as Egyptian armies carried his name into Nubia, into the Levant, into the wider ancient world. The great temple complex at Karnak, still the largest religious building complex ever constructed anywhere on earth, was raised primarily in his honor. Its forests of towering columns, its sacred lakes, its avenue of ram-headed sphinxes, all testifying to the extraordinary resources that flowed toward the worship of this solar composite deity during Egypt's imperial height. Walking through the hypostyle hall at Karnak even today, those surviving columns rising nearly 21 meters above the ground, it is possible to feel something of what the ancient Egyptians must have felt entering this space. Not just architectural grandeur, but the physical weight of divine presence, the sense of standing inside a theology made stone. But Ra's capacity for transformation did not end with Amun. Across Egyptian religious history, Ra merged, or was deeply identified with a remarkable range of other deities, each fusion revealing something new about how the Egyptians' understanding of their sun god continued to evolve and deepen. Ra-Harakti. Ra merged with Horus of the horizon, presented the sun god in his aspect as the falcon soaring across the widest possible expanse of sky, horizon to horizon, surveying all of creation from the greatest possible height. Khepri-Ra-Atum, the triple solar deity representing the sun's three daily stages in a single theological statement, expressed the complete arc of existence, birth, life, and death, unified within a single divine identity. Even Osiris, the god of the dead and resurrection, who might seem at first glance entirely removed from solar theology, became entangled with Ra in the nightly hours of the duat, the two deities merging briefly in the darkest hours of Ra's underworld passage to form a unified being sometimes described in funerary texts as the Ba of Ra is Osiris, the Ba of Osiris is Ra, a statement of such profound theological delicacy that scholars are still exploring its full implications today. These mergers were not confusing to the Egyptians, not contradictory, not signs of a religion losing its clarity of vision. They were, rather, the natural expression of a theological tradition that understood divinity as something far too vast and multifaceted to be contained within any single form or name. Ra was not diminished by becoming Amun-Ra, any more than light is diminished by passing through a prism and revealing its full spectrum of color. He was, in each merger, revealed more completely, and yet change was coming to Egypt. Deeper, more irreversible change than any theological evolution could accommodate. Beginning with Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt in 332 BCE, and continuing through the long centuries of Ptolemaic Greek rule and eventual Roman annexation in 30 BCE, Egypt found itself pulled into a Mediterranean world with very different religious priorities and very different ideas about the nature of the divine. The Ptolemaic rulers were shrewd enough to adopt Egyptian religious forms, to portray themselves as pharaohs, to build temples in the traditional style. The magnificent temple at Dendera, the island temple of Philae, are both Ptolemaic constructions that wear their Egyptian theology with genuine fluency. And within these temples, Ra continued to be honored. His solar bark continued its mythological journey. His rituals continued their careful daily rhythms. But the world was changing around those temple walls in ways no ritual could hold back. Greek philosophical ideas about monotheism and abstract divine principles were filtering into Egyptian theological thinking, reshaping from within the polytheistic framework that had held Ra's world in place for so long. When Rome absorbed Egypt into its empire, the pressure intensified. And then, in the centuries that followed, as Christianity spread with remarkable speed through North Africa and the Near East, the ancient temple religion of Egypt found its institutional foundations crumbling one by one. Temples were closed by imperial decree, their priests dispersed, their revenue streams cut off, their sacred rituals, those same carefully maintained sequences of offering and prayer and purification that had sustained Ra's divine presence for 3,000 years, performed for the last time by aging priests whose students would never carry the tradition forward. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Philae. The last known demotic inscription followed shortly after, and with them, the living chain of priestly knowledge that had maintained and transmitted Egypt's solar theology across 3 millennia was, at last, broken. But here is what history asks us to notice, quietly and carefully, before we accept too simple a story of ending. The light of Ra did not disappear from the world with the closing of his temples. It transformed, as it had always transformed, into new shapes within new theological frameworks. Solar symbolism runs deeply and unmistakably through early Christian iconography in Egypt. The Coptic cross with its circular halo echoing the solar disk, the imagery of resurrection and dawn that structured Easter theology, the depiction of Christ in light-saturated glory that owes more than a passing debt to the visual language developed over millennia to describe a falcon-headed God rising in triumph over the eastern horizon. These connections are not simple equations. They are the complex, layered residue of theological ideas that had spent thousands of years embedded in the deepest structures of how the people of the Nile Valley understood light, life, death, and renewal. Ra's stories, too, have proven far more durable than the civilization that first told them. The motif of the solar hero battling a chaos serpent each night, the pattern of death and rebirth woven into the daily movement of the sun, echoes through mythologies far beyond Egypt's borders, resonating across cultures and centuries, with a persistence that suggests these stories touch something genuinely fundamental in human experience. We still speak of darkness and light as metaphors for the full range of moral and spiritual possibility. We still feel, on some instinctive level, that the sun's arrival each morning is a small, quiet mercy. And perhaps, in the end, that is Ra's most enduring legacy. Not the towering obelisks, not the pyramids' blazing limestone faces, nor the elaborate funerary texts mapping every hour of the underworld's dark interior. His most enduring legacy is the simple, persistent human reflex of turning toward the morning light with something that feels, unmistakably, like relief. The oldest prayer, the first act of worship, a gesture that predates every civilization that ever rose along the banks of every river on earth. Somewhere beneath all the theology, all the ritual, all the extraordinary complexity of 3,000 years of solar religion, there is a human being standing in the cool air just before sunrise, watching the eastern sky begin to lighten, feeling the first warmth touch their face, and knowing, in a way that requires no priesthood and no temple and no sacred text to confirm, that something has been preserved through the long dark hours of the night. Ra endures, as light endures, not because his temples still stand, but because the sun still rises, patient, golden, eternal, as it always has, as it always will.